In the late autumn of 1988, 2 years after her husband's funeral, Elara Vance, aged 25, walked into the First National Bank of Harmony Creek and bought the old grist mill on the river. She paid, not with a check drawn on an account she did not have, but with a single, notarized contract and a list of 117 names bound in a new leather ledger. The bank manager, Marcus Thorne, a man who had tried to foreclose on her 900 acres just 24 months earlier, read the document twice, looked at the list of names, and simply nodded. The story of how this happened, how a 23-year-old widow facing a debt of $187,550 saved not only her farm, but the town's memory, begins with a death, a drought, and a small collection of clay pots filled with seeds nobody had planted for 50 years. Let me tell you about the debt first, because debt is where these stories always begin. The Vance farm, 900 acres of bottomland and rolling pasture, tucked into the fold of the Blue Ridge, had been in Liam Vance's family for 152 years. It was purchased in 1834 for the sum of $2,200 in gold coin. For 5 generations, the Vances had worked that land with a quiet reverence, avoiding debt as a matter of principle. The principle was simple, passed down from father to son. The land does not owe you a living, you owe the land your life. Debt was a promise made against a future you couldn't control, a bet against the certainty of flood and the caprice of drought. Liam Vance, Elara's husband, had been different. He was a good man, kind and strong, but he was a man of his time, the early 1980s. He had gone to the State Agricultural College for 2 years and come back with a head full of numbers about yield optimization, nitrogen inputs, and economies of scale. He saw the 900 acres not as a living thing to be tended, but as an asset to be maximized. The old ways were sentimental, he'd argue gently with his father. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills. In 1985, a year after his father died and a year before his own death, Liam took out the first significant loan in the farm's history. He borrowed $187,550 from the First National Bank of Harmony Creek. The loan officer was a new man in town, Marcus Thorne. Thorne was 36 then, with an MBA from a good state school and a firm belief in the predictive power of spreadsheets. He wore suits that were a little too crisp for a town like Harmony Creek, and he spoke of leverage and return on investment. He saw Liam Vance as a progressive, a young farmer willing to shed the inefficient habits of the past. The loan was for a new John Deere 4450 tractor, a 6-bottom plow, and a state-of-the-art planter. It was also for 20 tons of chemical fertilizer and enough patented hybrid corn seed to plant 400 acres fence row to fence row. The first year, 1985, was a good one. The rains came on time. The new tractor cut plowing time by 70%. The yield was 165 bushels per acre, the highest the Vance farm had ever seen. Liam was vindicated. He made his first annual payment of $21,150 on time. He and Elara, married 4 years by then, talked about the future, about expanding, about being the most productive farm in the county. Then, on April 17, 1986, Liam was trying to pull a stump from the lower 40. The chain snapped, recoiled, and the tractor, a 14,000-pound machine of green and yellow efficiency, rolled back into the creek bed. Liam was 26 years old. Elara was 23. They had been married for 5 years and 11 days. The grief was a physical weight, a shroud that settled over the 900 acres. But debt is immune to grief. 2 months after the funeral, the first letter from the bank arrived. It was polite, professional. It offered condolences and then reminded her that the next loan payment was due in 10 months. The farm's operating account held $4,328. The payment was more than 5 times that. Elara Vance, a widow at 23, was standing on 900 acres of land that was no longer truly hers. It belonged to the numbers in Marcus Thorne's spreadsheet. Let me tell you about Marcus Thorne. He was not a villain. In his own mind, he was a pragmatist, A realist in a world of sentimentalists. He was 38 years old, had been a bank manager for 12 years, and was known for his unsentimental but fair assessments of risk. He had grown up on a failing dairy farm himself, and had watched his father's pride curdle into bitterness as he clung to old ways that no longer worked. Marcus had vowed to understand the numbers, the systems, the cold logic that governed success and failure. He believed that emotion was the enemy of good business. He called Elara in for a meeting in June of 1986. The office was air-conditioned and smelled of paper and faint cologne. He sat across a wide mahogany desk, a picture of his wife and two daughters perfectly placed at the corner. He laid out the situation with calm precision. The total outstanding principal was $178,000. The commodity price for corn had dropped 18% since the previous year. Her input cost for seed and fertilizer for the next planting would be close to $30,000. He had run the projections. Even with a perfect harvest, she would likely fall short. The numbers, he said, his voice gentle but firm, are not in your favor, Mrs. Vance. He then presented his solution. It was logical, sensible, and compassionate. A developer from Charlotte was interested in the 300 acres bordering the state highway. They were offering $800 an acre, a total of $240,000. She could sell that parcel, pay off the entire loan, and be left with a 600-acre homestead, free and clear, plus over $50,000 in cash. It was a lifeline. It was the only rational choice. You can't farm 900 acres by yourself, he concluded. This isn't a failure. It's a strategic realignment. It's what Liam would have wanted, to know you were secure. Elara sat there, a young woman in a simple cotton dress, her hands resting in her lap. She listened to his logic, she heard the kindness in his voice, and she felt a cold certainty rising from a place deeper than reason. The land was a whole. It was not a collection of parcels to be sold off like spare parts. Selling the highway frontage would be like selling the farm's front door. She looked at Marcus Thorne. I need some time to think, she said. He nodded, confident. Of course, take a month. But the numbers, Mrs. Vance, the numbers don't change. For 2 weeks, Elara walked the farm. She walked the fence lines Liam's great-grandfather had set with stone posts. She walked the creek where her husband had died. She sat in the cab of the new John Deere tractor, a green monument to a future that would never arrive. The farm was silent, waiting. One evening, cleaning out a dusty corner of the main barn, her hand brushed against a large, sea-worn trunk. It was locked. It had belonged to Liam's great-grandfather, a man named Samuel Vance, who had died in 1938. Liam had said it was full of old junk, papers mostly. She found the key in a tin box on a high shelf. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed newspapers, were not just papers. There were 24 clay pots, each sealed with beeswax and labeled with elegant faded script. Blue Hopi corn, Cherokee Trail of Tears beans, Seminole pumpkin, and underneath them 6 thick, leather-bound ledgers. For the next week, Elara did not sleep. She read. The ledgers were not journals of daily life. They were a meticulous 50-year record of a different kind of farming. Samuel Vance had not been just a farmer. He was a scientist of place. He recorded rainfall to the 100th of an inch, soil temperatures, planting dates, phases of the moon. But most of all, he recorded the relationships between things. He never planted a field of just corn. He planted what the local Cherokee had taught his grandfather, the 3 sisters. Corn for structure, beans to climb the corn and fix nitrogen in the soil, and squash to shade the ground, preserving moisture and preventing weeds. But Samuel's system was infinitely more complex. He had spent decades selecting seeds, breeding varieties of each sister that were perfectly adapted to the microclimates of their 900 acres. The blue Hopi corn for the sandy loam of the upper fields, a different, sturdier variety for the clay-heavy bottomland. He had 7 varieties of pole beans, each with a different purpose, some for eating fresh, some for drying, some purely for their nitrogen-fixing prowess. His ledgers contained hand-drawn maps, complex crop rotation schedules spanning a decade, and detailed notes on pest control, using beneficial insects, and plantings of marigold and rosemary. The ledgers were a complete operating system for the farm, a system built not on maximizing the yield of a single commodity, but on maximizing the resilience of the whole. There were notes in the margins. 1918, Spanish flu, no help. The sisters fed us. And another. 1932, the bank in town failed. Hoover is president. No money for seed. We have our own. The final entry, from 1937, was a letter to a son who had already left for the city. They will tell you this is the old way. They will tell you it is inefficient. Do not listen. What is efficient is what endures. A field of only corn is a field of beggars, demanding more from the soil than it gives. A field of the sisters is a community. They feed the soil, and then the soil feeds us. Remember this: what is rigid breaks, what is woven together holds. Elara closed the final ledger. The silence of the house was deep. She looked at the clay pots. This was the inheritance that mattered, not 900 acres of dirt, but 150 years of knowledge about how to live on it. The next week, she went back to see Marcus Thorne. She was wearing the same simple dress. She sat in the same chair. "I've thought about your offer," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm not selling the land." Thorne leaned back, his face a mask of professional patience. "Mrs. Vance, Elara, I understand the emotional attachment. I truly do. But this is a business decision." "Yes," she said, "it is." "The numbers," he started. "I have different numbers," she interrupted. She slid one of Samuel Vance's ledgers across the polished desk. It was open to a page from 1934, the worst year of the Dust Bowl. The page showed a diagram of an interplanted field, and in the corner, a tally. Corn, 80 bushels. Dried beans, 1,200 pounds. Squash, 3 tons. All from a single 10-acre plot, with no irrigation and no fertilizer bought from a store. Thorne looked at the old book as if it were a curiosity from a museum. "This is history. It's fascinating. But it's not a business plan for 1986. "My business plan," Elara said, "is to make the loan payment in full in 12 months. He stared at her. He saw no fear in her eyes, no grief-stricken delusion. He saw a resolve that was as calm and solid as a river stone. It unsettled him. Against his better judgment, against every rule in his training, he found himself saying, "The bank requires a viable operational plan." "I'll provide one," she said. He gave her the 12 months. He wrote in his official report that he had granted an extension on compassionate grounds. But the truth was more complicated. He was a man who believed in numbers, and for the first time, he had a feeling he was missing some. The work that followed was brutal. Elara sold the new John Deere tractor. The sale brought in $38,000, enough to live on and to buy what she needed. She kept the old, smaller farmall tractor Liam's grandfather had used. It was less efficient, but more versatile. She couldn't afford to hire help. She worked from before sunrise until after the moon was high. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. The community in Harmony Creek watched. They were a Greek chorus of farmers, men who had known Liam all his life. They saw her out on the old farmall, dragging a 2-bottom plow instead of the new 6-bottom. They saw her planting not in long, straight rows with a machine, but walking the fields, creating strange, intricate mounds with a hoe. "She's lost her mind," one of them said in the grain co-op. "Grief does strange things. She's trying to go back in time." "It's a shame," said another. "That's good bottom land. Thorne will have it by Christmas." But a few of the older men in their 70s and 80s, watched with a different kind of expression. They remembered their own fathers talking about planting in mounds, about saving seed. They didn't say anything. They just watched. Elara followed the ledgers as if they were scripture. She planted 80 acres that first year, a patchwork quilt of the three sisters. It was a fraction of the 400 acres Liam had planted to corn, but it was all she could manage alone. Let me tell you about the planting, because the details are the whole story. She didn't just put seeds in the ground. She soaked the corn seeds in a compost tea made from a recipe in the ledgers. She planted the kernels in mounds of soil, enriched with fish heads she got for free from the market in the next town. When the corn was 6 inches high, she planted the beans around it and the squash in between. That summer, 1987, was dry. A moderate drought settled over the county. By July, the leaves on the monoculture cornfields of her neighbors were curling in the heat. The soil was exposed, cracked, and baked hard by the sun. Men stood at the edge of their fields, their faces grim, watching their investment wither. But on Elara's 80 acres, something different was happening. The broad leaves of the Seminole pumpkins formed a living mulch, shading the ground, keeping the soil cool and moist. The corn stalks were not as thick or uniformly tall as the hybrid varieties, but they were deep green and resilient. The bean vines, heavy with pods, were climbing them toward the sun. The fields were not neat and orderly. They were a chaotic, tangled, vibrant jungle of life. She had created a system that conserved its own water. She didn't have a massive harvest of a single cash crop. She had something else. She had a continuous rolling harvest that started in July and ended with the first frost in October. She had sweet corn, green beans, and summer squash she sold at the farmer's market in town. Later, she had dried beans, winter squash, and the blue corn, which she harvested by hand. The work was endless. She picked beans until her back screamed. She hauled squash from the field in an old wagon. She sat on her porch in the evenings, shelling beans and listening to the crickets, her muscles aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it was in her bones. In November, she went back to the bank for her review with Marcus Thorne. The 12 months were up. He had his spreadsheets ready. He had the county-wide yield reports. The drought had been devastating. The average corn yield was down to 95 bushels per acre. The commodity price was still low. Several of her neighbors were facing foreclosure themselves. He looked at her, expecting defeat. "I assume you're here to discuss the sale of the property," he said, his voice holding that same professional sympathy. Elara said nothing. She opened her own ledger, a simple spiral-bound notebook, on his desk. It was filled with her small, neat handwriting. She had not sold her corn to the grain elevator for the low commodity price. She had ground some of it into cornmeal herself, using a small, hand-cranked mill. She sold it at the farmer's market for $3 a pound. She had sold her dried beans for $2 a pound, her squash for 50 cents a pound. She had sold braids of blue corn as decorations. She had sold seeds to organic gardeners in the city. She pointed to the bottom line. Her gross income from the 80 acres was $32,450. Her expenses were minimal. She had no fertilizer bill. She had no seed bill because she had saved her own. Her only major cost was fuel for the old tractor. Her net profit was $28,700. Then she slid a check across the desk. It was for $21,150, the full annual payment. Marcus Thorne stared at the check. He stared at her ledger. He picked up his calculator and ran the numbers. Her net profit per acre was $358. The average net profit for the conventional corn farmers in the county that year, after accounting for their high input costs and a low yield, was negative $42 per acre. They had lost money. She had made a significant profit. He was silent for a full minute. He looked at her, and the professional mask was gone. He was just a man, confused. "This is a novelty," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "A boutique operation. It's not scalable. You can't make a living selling cornmeal at a farmer's market forever. You got lucky with the drought." "It wasn't luck," Elara said quietly. "The system is designed for drought. It's in the book." He gave her another year. He had no choice. She had made the payment, but he was certain it was a fluke. The market for decorative corn in $5 bags of beans was finite. Next year, when the rains returned and the commodity prices recovered, his numbers would be proven right. He was sure of it. That winter, Elara thought about what he'd said. Scalable. It was a word from his world, not hers. But she knew he was right in one sense. She couldn't work that hard, by herself, forever. And she couldn't save the farm by selling produce one bag at a time from the back of her truck. She needed something more. She needed a scale not the size of her fields, but the value of what came out of them. The problem was the corn. The blue Hopi corn was magnificent. It had a nutty, sweet flavor that modern yellow corn lacked. Ground into meal, it was sublime. But her small, hand-cranked mill could only produce about 20 pounds a day. To create a real business, she needed a proper grist mill. And that's when she started thinking about the old mill in town. Let me tell you about the mill. It sat on the banks of Harmony Creek, a 3-story stone building that had been the heart of the town's economy for a century. It was built in 1880 by the town's founder. For generations, farmers from all over the county brought their grain there. The sound of the great water wheel turning and the massive granite stones grinding was the town's heartbeat. But in 1966, a multinational agricultural corporation built a massive, centralized grain elevator and processing plant 30 miles away. They could process grain faster and cheaper. The old mill couldn't compete. It closed its doors. The water wheel fell silent. The building slowly began to decay, and like so many other assets of a dying small town, it eventually fell into the hands of the bank. It was another non-performing asset on Marcus Thorne's books, a liability. He'd been trying to sell it for years, but no one wanted a derelict stone building that needed a new roof and 100 other repairs. Elara knew she couldn't buy the mill, but she began to form an idea, a different kind of number than the ones Marcus Thorne understood. Her second year, 1988, she did not work alone. The story of her small success had spread through the valley. The first to come was an old farmer named Arthur Jenkins. He was 72 years old and was about to lose his family's 150-acre farm. His son had moved away. He couldn't handle the work himself anymore. He had watched Elara from his truck, watched her planting the old way. One day, he showed up at her farm, hat in his hands. He said, "My wife makes the best tomato relish you've ever tasted. From a recipe her grandmother brought over from Italy, but you can't make a living selling relish at the church bazaar." Elara invited him in for coffee. She showed him Samuel Vance's ledgers. She showed him her own books. She proposed an idea. What if he dedicated 5 acres of his land to growing the specific heirloom tomatoes his wife used? And what if he grew pole beans and a specific variety of sweet pepper, all from seeds she would give him? She would sell it all, not as raw produce, but as part of a larger system. He would be a partner, not a competitor. Arthur Jenkins, a man who hadn't had a hopeful thought in 10 years, agreed. Soon, others came. A young couple who had bought a small farm hoping to live off the land, but were drowning in debt. A woman whose husband had been injured and could no longer manage their dairy herd. By the spring of 1988, Elara Vance was no longer just a farmer. She was the quiet center of an informal cooperative of 12 farms. They were all using Samuel Vance's principles, adapted to their own land. They were diversifying. They were planting not for the commodity market, but for a local food economy that didn't yet exist. Elara's main project that year was what she called the Harmony Creek Corn Share. It was a simple idea, radical for its time. She went door to door in town and in the surrounding communities. She didn't ask people to buy a bag of cornmeal. She asked them to buy a share of the harvest. For $200, a family would get a weekly box of fresh produce from the cooperative's farms from June to October. And, starting in the fall, they would get 10 pounds of stone-ground cornmeal, or whole wheat flour, every month through the winter. The catch, she explained, was the mill. The program would only work if they had the old mill running again. She wasn't asking for an investment. She was asking for a commitment. She collected signatures, not on a petition, but on a contract, a promise to buy a share of the harvest, contingent on the mill being operational. By September, she had 117 signed contracts. That was 117 families, representing nearly a quarter of the town's population, who had prepaid for their winter food. The total value of those contracts was $23,400. It was real money, a guaranteed market. She also secured a letter of intent from a new bakery that had opened in a nearby, more affluent town. The baker was a young woman who had trained in France. She tasted Elara's cornmeal and her eyes lit up. She had been searching for ingredients with genuine flavor. She signed a letter agreeing to purchase 500 pounds of stone-ground cornmeal and 200 pounds of whole wheat flour every week, a contract worth over $40,000 a year. Elara now had her own set of numbers. They weren't projections based on market averages. They were promises between neighbors. They were a community knitting itself back together. In October of 1988, her final loan payment was due. She received a formal registered letter from the bank. It informed her that her extension was over. A meeting was scheduled for October 15th to finalize the foreclosure proceedings. The letter was signed by Marcus Thorne. She walked into the bank on the appointed day. She was 25 years old. She wore a clean work shirt and jeans. She carried a new leather-bound ledger. Thorne was there, along with the bank's lawyer. The mood was somber, professional. They were there to execute a legal procedure.
"Elara," Thorne began, his voice low. "I'm sorry it has come to this. We gave you every opportunity, but the debt is too large. The farm simply can't generate the kind of capital required to service it. The numbers are the numbers." It was the same phrase he had used 2 years before, the same unshakable faith in his version of reality. Elara did not respond. She placed the new ledger on the center of the polished mahogany table. It made a soft, solid sound in the quiet room. She opened it. "These are my numbers," she said. The first page was a summary of the cooperative. 12 farms, their acreage, their pledged crops. The second section contained the 117 signed corn share contracts, each one a testament to a local family's trust. The next page was a letter of intent from the bakery. Then came a detailed 5-year business plan, written in her neat, steady hand. It showed how the cooperative, with the mill as its hub, would generate a projected net income of over $150,000 by its 3rd year. It showed how the farms would be debt-free within a decade. The final page was a formal proposal. It was addressed to the Board of Directors of the First National Bank of Harmony Creek. She was not asking for another loan. She was making them an offer. She wanted to buy the old mill. The price she offered was its assessed value as a derelict property, $15,000. She would not be paying in cash. The payment, the proposal stated, would be a 10% equity share in the Harmony Creek Agricultural Cooperative. The bank would become a partner. For 10 years, they would receive 10% of the co-op's net profits. Her projections showed their initial $15,000 investment would return over $80,000 in that time. After 10 years, the co-op would have the option to buy out the bank's share. She was turning their non-performing asset into a profit center. She was turning her debt into their investment. She was taking his language, assets, equity, return on investment, and using it to build a world he couldn't see on his spreadsheets. Thorne and the lawyer read the proposal in stunned silence. The lawyer began to speak, to raise objections about risk and liability, but Thorne held up a hand. He was no longer looking at the numbers in the ledger. He was looking at the list of names on the corn share contracts. He was the manager of the town's bank. He knew every name on that list. It was the school teacher, the owner of the hardware store, the town doctor, half of his own tellers. These were his depositors, his customers, his community. He could foreclose on one young widow. He could justify it with numbers. But this ledger did not represent one farm.
It represented the collective will of an entire community to feed itself, to rebuild its own economy from the ground up. To foreclose now would not be a business decision. It would be an act of war against the town he was supposed to serve. He looked at Elara. He saw the quiet, unshakable certainty in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had 2 years ago, but now he understood its source. Her strength was not her own. It was rooted in 150 years of accumulated wisdom, and it was now interwoven with the hopes of her neighbors. She had built something his bank could not break because it was not rigid. It was woven together. He closed the ledger. "I'll present this to the board," he said. 2 weeks later, the deal was approved. Elara Vance paid her outstanding loan payment for the year, and the bank sold her the mill, not for cash, but for a stake in a future she had built out of nothing but her great-grandfather's seeds and her own refusal to surrender. The aftermath came slowly, then all at once. The reopening of the mill was a town event. Arthur Jenkins, his farm saved, was the first in line with a wagon full of heirloom wheat. The sound of the great stones grinding, powered by the creek once more, brought tears to the eyes of the old-timers. It was the sound of a heartbeat returning. The cooperative thrived. Within 5 years, it had grown to include 25 farms. They didn't just sell produce. They started a small cannery, a bakery, and a creamery. The Harmony Creek brand became known throughout the region for its quality and flavor. Young people, who for a generation had been leaving for the cities, started to stay. A few even came back, taking over their parents' farms, not as a burden, but as an opportunity. They came to Elara to learn, and she would sit with them on her porch, Samuel Vance's ledgers open on the table between them. Marcus Thorne stayed at the bank until he retired in 2012. He became a champion of small-scale, community-based agricultural lending. He turned the First National Bank of Harmony Creek into a model for rural economic development. He never spoke of the meeting in his office in 1988, but he once told a young loan officer a story about a woman who taught him that the most important assets don't always show up on a balance sheet. He attended Elara's funeral in 2045. She was 82 years old and had died peacefully on the farm that was still, and had always been, hers. The story of Elara Vance is not about defeating a bank. It is about a different definition of wealth. The world of finance sees wealth as a number in an account, a liquid asset that can be moved and maximized. But there is another kind of wealth, an older kind. It is the wealth of fertile soil, of saved seed, of knowledge passed down through generations. It is the wealth of a community that knows how to feed itself. This kind of wealth is not liquid, it is solid, it is rooted, and it cannot be foreclosed on. A system built for short-term profit is brittle. It shatters in the first drought. A system built on resilience, on the intricate relationships between corn, beans, and squash, between a farmer and her neighbors, endures. What is efficient is not always what is strong. What is strong is what is woven together.